Skylar Neese was 16 when her life narrowed to a bedroom window in Star City, West Virginia, a place small enough that people believed they knew one another simply by proximity. She lived with her parents, Dave and Mary Neese, who worried about her in the ordinary ways parents worry about teenagers' grades, friends, moods that shifted without explanation. Skylar was described by those who loved her as bright, affectionate, impulsive in a way that felt familiar to anyone who remembers adolescence. Her phone was rarely far from her hand. Her friendships mattered intensely. In the months before she died, two names dominated her world: Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. They were, by most outward measures, inseparable. Photos captured them cheek to cheek, arms thrown over shoulders, faces angled toward the camera with the practiced ease of teenage closeness. They walked the same halls, shared secrets, exchanged messages late into the night. To adults watching from the outside, it looked like a tight-knit trio weathering the ordinary dramas of high school. But intimacy can hide fractures. When closeness becomes the currency of identity, exclusion feels like annihilation. And by early 2012, the bonds that tied the three girls together were fraying in ways that were both visible and ignored. Skylar sensed it first. Her messages grew anxious, then plaintive. She wrote about feeling pushed aside, about being talked over or left behind. On social media, subtleties sharpened into weapons, inside jokes she no longer shared, photos posted without her, cryptic comments that seemed designed to sting while preserving plausible deniability. None of it was criminal. All of it was corrosive. The cruelty of teenage dynamics lies in how ordinary they appear, how easily adults dismiss them as phases. But for Skylar, the loss of belonging was not a phase. It was a daily humiliation. Shalia Eddy was charismatic and volatile, capable of warmth that could switch to cruelty without warning. Rachel Schoaf was quieter, more inward, someone who struggled with her own sense of worth. Together, their bond hardened. As Skylar felt herself slipping from the center, the other two drew closer, defining themselves against her. This is not unusual in adolescence, where alliances form and dissolve with dizzying speed. What was unusual, what would later horrify investigators, was how resentment curdled into something far darker, and how that darkness found space to grow in plain sight. The town itself offered few places to hide, yet it was precisely this familiarity that dulled alarm. Kids snuck out, parents worried. Everyone assumed that tomorrow would arrive as usual. Skylar's parents did not believe she was in danger. They believed, as many parents do, that the worst threats were external strangers, drugs, bad influences, not the friends who sat at their kitchen table. The danger was intimate, woven into the everyday fabric of teenage life. On the night of July 5th, 2012, that intimacy would become lethal. But the story does not begin with the night. It begins with a pattern: escalating exclusion, whispered grievances, a sense among two girls that the presence of a third had become intolerable. What could have remained a painful but survivable breakup of friendship instead metastasized. Later, prosecutors would argue that the idea of murder did not arrive fully formed. It evolved. It was rehearsed in words before it was enacted in reality, and it was rehearsed in a place that felt safe: private messages, shared jokes, the illusion that nothing typed could ever demand accountability. Skylar's last weeks were marked by attempts to repair what was breaking. She reached out. She asked questions. She tried to reinsert herself into a friendship that no longer wanted her. To listen to her messages is to hear a teenager bargaining for dignity. What did I do? Why won't you talk to me? The pain is not dramatic. It is mundane, which makes it worse. There is no villain monologue, only silence and deflection. Meanwhile, the distance hardened into resolve on the other side. When Skylar disappeared in the early hours after sneaking out of her house, The town mobilized in the way small towns do. Searches were organized. Posters went up. Interviews were given. The same girls who had drifted from Skylar now stood before cameras, tearful and concerned, appealing for her safe return. The performance was convincing because it borrowed from truth. They had been close once. They knew what to say because they had said it before, in better times. For weeks, the narrative was uncertainty. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she met someone online. Maybe she just needed space. Each theory allowed the community to postpone the unthinkable. But there were early contradictions. The timeline did not sit right. Digital footprints told a story that did not align with public pleas. Investigators noticed inconsistencies, not dramatic red flags, but small misalignments that accumulate when people are lying. In modern cases, the truth often waits in servers and devices, patient and exact. Messages do not forget. Locations leave traces. What teenagers believe is ephemeral is, in fact, enduring. The emotional gravity of the case rests not only in the act that would later be proven, but in the recognition that so many moments offered off-ramps. Friendship could have ended. Silence could have prevailed. Adults could have intervened earlier if the signs had seemed more than ordinary teenage cruelty. Yet the path continued, step by incremental step, until it reached a place no one wanted to imagine. The banality of the lead-up is what indicts it. There was no need for the extraordinary. The ordinary was enough. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the trio's history mattered. Understanding how affection turned to contempt, how loyalty inverted into hostility, was essential to understanding what followed. This was not a story of sudden madness. It was a story of normalization of ideas tested in conversation until they no longer shocked the speaker. The first time a thought is voiced, it startles. The second time, it invites a reply. By the 10th, it feels like a plan. Skylar Neese's name would soon be known far beyond Star City. But before the headlines, before the courtrooms, before the sentences that would attempt to impose order on chaos, there was a girl trying to belong and two friends deciding that belonging would no longer include her. The tragedy begins there, in the quiet cruelty that most people recognize from their own youth and in the failure to imagine how far such cruelty could be taken when reinforced by secrecy, proximity, and a shared resolve to erase a person rather than confront a feeling. The investigation would eventually hinge on what Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf said when they believed no one else was listening. In the months before Skylar disappeared, their private messages formed a parallel reality, one in which resentment was validated, jokes sharpened into threats, and the unthinkable was spoken often enough to lose its weight. This was not a sudden descent. It was a gradual accommodation to an idea that should have repelled them. Instead, it settled in. Teenage communication is relentless. Messages stack upon messages, trivialities braided with confessions, boredom punctured by cruelty. In this stream, the two girls rehearsed a version of themselves that felt powerful. Skylar was recast not as a friend in pain, but as a problem to be solved. Complaints hardened into grievances. Grievances into contempt. The language shifted. Where there had once been affection, there was now mockery. Where there had been frustration, there was calculation. It is chilling precisely because it is familiar, people convincing one another that their anger is justified, that their target deserves what is coming, that responsibility can be shared and therefore diluted. What made these conversations dangerous was not their theatricality, there was little of that, but their normalization. Murder entered the chat, not as a dramatic vow, but as a possibility, then a joke, then a plan. Investigators would later describe a countdown, a ritualized narrowing of time that turned anticipation into resolve. Counting down does two things. It makes an act feel inevitable, and it bonds the counters together against the world outside. Each number spoken is a small commitment, harder to undo than the last. All of this unfolded against a backdrop of ordinary routines. School days ended. Evenings stretched long. Parents believed their children were safe at home, phones glowing in bedrooms. The girls learned, as teenagers do, how to carve out privacy within surveillance, how to say just enough to avoid suspicion, how to appear unremarkable. There were no overt threats delivered to adults, no notes left behind. The secrecy was banal, tucked into the margins of normal life. The moral dissonance was striking. In public, Shalia and Rachel maintained the performance of concerned friends. In private, they refined their plan. The split allowed them to manage their own fear. To admit openly what they were considering would have invited intervention. To keep it contained allowed the fantasy to mature. Psychologists would later point to this compartmentalization as a critical factor, the ability to hold two incompatible selves without forcing a reckoning. Skylar, meanwhile, remained within reach, texting, asking to meet, seeking clarity. Her presence complicated the narrative the other two were constructing. It is harder to dehumanize someone who keeps reminding you of their humanity. This may be why the plan hardened when it did. Ending the friendship would have required explanation, confrontation, or distance. Ending Skylar would require none of those things. It would be permanent. It would also, in their distorted logic, be simpler. On July 5th, 2012, the plan moved from abstraction to logistics. Messages coordinated a meeting, a ride, a time. The language was careful, stripped of flourish. This was not the bravado of criminals. It was the efficiency of teenagers trying not to be caught. They understood enough about risk to mitigate it, not enough to grasp consequence. The same tools that allowed them to communicate seamlessly also recorded their intentions with unforgiving precision. The countdown mattered. It transformed hesitation into momentum. Each tick toward the chosen moment was a chance to stop and a reinforcement that stopping would mean betraying the pact. Shared guilt became shared courage. By the time Skylar slipped out of her house in the early morning hours, the decision had already been made elsewhere in words sent and received, acknowledged and affirmed. When Skylar climbed into the car, she did so trusting the past. She trusted that shared memories still meant something. That familiarity was a form of safety. This is the deepest cruelty of crimes born within relationships. They weaponize trust. There was no forced entry, no struggle at the threshold. The invitation itself was the instrument. In the days that followed, the messages did not stop. They changed. Concern replaced coordination. Confusion replaced certainty. The performance resumed, now with higher stakes. Investigators would later map the shift, noting how the digital tone aligned with public statements. The same fluency that enabled planning now enabled deception. Yet the record was there, immutable, waiting for someone to read it with patience. The outrage that would later grip the public often focused on the idea of planning as if premeditation alone explained the horror. But planning here was not the product of a mastermind. It was the outcome of mutual reinforcement, of small permissions granted repeatedly until the boundary dissolved. Each message that failed to reject the idea moved it closer to reality. Silence, in this context, was not neutral. It was consent. What makes this section of the story so difficult to absorb is its proximity to our own lives. Many people have vented about friends, joked darkly, counted down to moments they dread or anticipate. The difference here is not category but degree, and the degree was reached through repetition. No single message condemns. The accumulation does. It is a lesson that feels accusatory because it implicates the culture of constant communication itself, where words feel weightless and consequences distant. By the time the town was searching fields and woods, the plan had already achieved its final form. The countdown was over. What remained was the long tail of a decision made in private and executed in trust. The digital trail would eventually speak, but not before the community endured weeks of uncertainty and hope. In that gap, the girls lived double lives, carrying a secret that was already beginning to unravel them. The night Skylar Neese was killed did not announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly, folded into the early hours of July 6, 2012, when the world feels paused and decisions seem easier to make because fewer people are awake to witness them. Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window shortly after midnight, a routine act for a teenager seeking a few hours of freedom. She left behind a note for her parents, an attempt at reassurance that suggested she expected to return. The simplicity of the gesture is devastating. It speaks to a future she still believed in. Shalia, Eddie, and Rachel Schoaf were waiting in a car nearby. The arrangement appeared ordinary. Friends meeting up, nothing more. There was no sign of struggle, no alarm raised. Skylar got into the back seat willingly. This detail would later matter, not just legally but morally. It underscored the depth of trust she placed in the two people who had already decided she would not leave the car alive. They drove out of town, away from familiar streets and into rural darkness. The choice of location was not dramatic, only practical. Fields and back roads offered privacy. The car stopped in a remote area across the state line in Pennsylvania, a patch of land that would later become a crime scene. The distance mattered. It placed physical space between the act and the community that would soon be searching for Skylar, hoping she was still alive somewhere within reach. What happened next is known because one of the perpetrators eventually told it, in fragments that were later corroborated. Skylar was attacked outside the car. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. She fought back. This, too, is an essential truth. The narrative of teenage cruelty can sometimes flatten victims into symbols, but Skylar resisted. She screamed. She tried to survive. The fact that her attackers were her friends did not render her passive. It made her desperate. The brutality of the act was not theatrical. It was chaotic and intimate, the kind of violence that leaves no one unchanged. The girls had imagined the moment through words, but reality refused to conform to fantasy. The physicality of it, the weight of a body, the sound of breath, the irreversibility of injury asserted itself. When it was over, Skylar was dead. She was 16 years old. They left her body where it fell and drove away. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. The abandonment was complete. This, perhaps more than the violence itself, captures the moral void of the act. To leave someone you once loved alone in the dark, in a place chosen for its emptiness, is to deny their humanity twice, first in killing them, and then in erasing them. Back in Star City, the morning arrived as usual. Skylar's parents discovered she was gone and called the police. The machinery of concern activated quickly, searches, interviews, community mobilization. Shalia and Rachel joined the effort, standing alongside adults, distributing flyers, speaking to reporters. Their grief appeared credible because grief is easy to mimic when one understands its language. They spoke of worry, of missing their friend, of hoping she would come home. The performance was sustained not for hours, but for months. The town held on to hope. Teenagers run away. They come back. Every new tip promised resolution. Every day without news deepened the ache. Skylar's parents lived in suspension, oscillating between fear and faith. The cruelty of uncertainty is that it never settles. It demands endurance without offering relief. Behind the scenes, investigators worked methodically. They reviewed timelines, phone records, and inconsistencies. They noticed how often Shalia and Rachel appeared in the narrative, how their accounts shifted subtly over time. Digital evidence began to coalesce into a shape that contradicted their public story. Messages placed them together at critical moments. Location data suggested movement that did not align with their claims. The psychological toll on the perpetrators was uneven. Shalia maintained the performance with chilling ease, posting messages that seemed designed to taunt, to assert control over the narrative. Rachel, by contrast, began to fracture. Guilt, fear, and isolation eroded the compartmentalization that had made the act possible. She struggled to carry the secret alone. The bond that had once fueled their resolve now became a source of pressure. In January 2013, Rachel Schoaf confessed to her role in the murder and led authorities to Skylar's remains. The discovery was a brutal confirmation of what many had begun to fear. Hope collapsed into grief. The community's outrage found an object. There was no longer a mystery to manage, only a loss to mourn and a crime to confront. The recovery of Skylar's body closed one chapter and opened another. The question shifted from where she was to how this could have happened and why. The answers would not satisfy. They would not restore what was taken. They would, however, force a reckoning with the reality that the most profound dangers are sometimes the most familiar, and that trust, once broken at this scale, leaves scars that extend far beyond a single life. The confession did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of silence, heavier and more final. When Rachel Schoaf led investigators to Skylar Neese's remains in a wooded area of Greene County, Pennsylvania, the truth replaced speculation with something far more painful. Skylar had not run away. She had not been lost. She had been taken deliberately by the people she trusted most. For her parents, the discovery was not only the confirmation of death, but the collapse of every hope they had been forced to carry for 6 months. The legal process that followed was swift by comparison, but no less devastating. Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and cooperated with prosecutors. Her confession outlined the planning, the countdown, the execution. She spoke of fear of Shalia Eddy, fear of backing out, fear of being alone. The court listened, not to absolve, but to understand. She was sentenced to 30 years to life, with the possibility of parole after 3 decades. It was a sentence that acknowledged both her youth and the gravity of her actions, though no number could reconcile the loss with justice. Shalia Eddy was arrested soon after and charged with first-degree murder. Unlike Rachel, she did not confess. Her defense attempted to fracture the narrative, to shift blame, to cast doubt. But the evidence was dense and cumulative: digital records, witness testimony, Rachel's account. In 2014, Shalia pleaded guilty to first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The contrast between the two sentences reflected the court's assessment of culpability, but it also exposed the limits of the system. Punishment could be calibrated. Damage could not. In the courtroom, Skylar's parents spoke of their daughter in the present tense, as parents often do when language refuses to accommodate loss. They described a girl who loved deeply, who felt betrayal acutely, who did not deserve the fate assigned to her. Their grief was disciplined, dignified, and devastating. It reminded everyone present that the case was not an abstract lesson about teenage psychology or digital culture. It was about a person whose absence would echo through a family's life forever. Public reaction was fierce. The idea that a murder could be planned through casual messages, that it could be hidden behind smiles and interviews, ignited a particular kind of anger. It felt like a betrayal of assumptions about friendship, about youth, about safety. Commentators searched for explanations that might contain the horror, bullying, mental health, peer pressure. Each offered partial insight, none offered relief. The truth resisted simplification. What endures from the case is not only the brutality of the crime, but the ordinariness of its components. There was no secret cult, no elaborate conspiracy. There were phones, feelings, and a feedback loop that rewarded cruelty with affirmation. The countdown, often cited as evidence of cold-bloodedness, also revealed something more unsettling: how ritual can anesthetize conscience, how repetition can make even murder feel procedural. For educators and parents, the case became a cautionary reference point, not because it suggested that teenage friendships are inherently dangerous, but because it demonstrated how harm can incubate in private spaces adults rarely enter. The lesson is not surveillance, but attention to shifts in behavior, to patterns of exclusion, to the emotional economies that govern adolescent life. Even so, no amount of vigilance guarantees safety. That is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth. Skylar Neese is remembered now through foundations, scholarships, and advocacy in her name. These efforts are attempts to convert grief into purpose, to assert that her life mattered beyond the manner of her death. They are also acts of resistance against the reduction of her story to spectacle. Skylar was not a symbol. She was a girl who loved her friends and believed in their love for her. The final reckoning of the case lies not in the sentences handed down, but in the questions it leaves behind. How do we teach empathy in a culture that rewards performance? How do we interrupt cruelty before it escalates? How do we honor victims without turning perpetrators into curiosities? There are no clean answers. There is only the obligation to remember accurately and to refuse the comfort of myths. In the end, the story of Skylar Neese is a story about proximity, how closeness can nurture or destroy, how intimacy amplifies both care and harm. It forces a recognition that evil does not always announce itself with menace. Sometimes it arrives smiling, familiar, speaking in the language of friendship. And by the time it is recognized for what it is, the damage is already done.